morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of 2021 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. We received apologies from Anna Sarwar this morning and I welcome Daniel Johnson as a substitute. Daniel, this is your first meeting as a substitute member. Please can you declare any relevant interests you may have?
Well, thank you for your welcome, Convener, but I don't have any declarations to make at this time, beyond my, obviously my written register.
Thank you, Daniel. Very grateful for that. Okay, thank you, Daniel. The very first item on agenda this morning, therefore, is there to take evidence on the budget number 5 bill at stage 2. We're joined for this item by Kate Forbes, the Cabinet Secretary of Finance, and by Scottish Government officials, Dougie McLaren, the Deputy Director of Public Spending, and Graham Owenson, who's Team Leader of Local Government Finance, Local Taxation Policy and Business Rates Unit. You've got a big title there, Graham. I welcome our witnesses to the meeting and I invite Kate Forbes, the Cabinet Secretary, to make an opening statement.
Thanks very much, Convener. And before turning to stage 2 amendments, I wanted to thank the committee both for its report on the budget, which I responded to last week, and also for the constructive approach to agreeing the timetable for this year's budget process, given the delayed UK budget. The truncated timetable continues with stage 3 of the budget bill scheduled for consideration tomorrow, following stage 1 and the Scottish rate resolution, both on the 25th of February. Convener, these amendments have the broad purpose of incorporating into the bill further spending proposals that have been developed since its introduction on the 28th of January, in light of the change in the funding position since then, which seems to be a bit of an understatement. Specifically, the funding changes are an extra approximately £1.1 billion, that's combined resource capital and FTs, from the UK supplementary estimates 2020-21. Those were notified to us last month and they're being carried over into 2021-2022 out with the reserve. Also, the headroom from the net consequentials of £1.175 billion of resource from the UK budget minus the £500 million that we had already made at the bill's introduction. Today's 13 amendments give effect to the proposed spending changes, and I hope that the supporting document we submitted to the committee has been useful to members. In summary, with reference to that document, the changes relate to the proposals in my parliamentary statement on the 16th of February. That totals £881 million of resource, £197 million of capital grant and £41.5 million of FTs, and also further commitments totalling £526.8 million of resource. The only changes from the 16th February statement are that 2 of the capital funding elements are being profiled over 2 years rather than 1. Namely, town centres and 20-minute neighbourhoods, in respect of which £30 million is proposed for 2021-22 from the £50 million total, and the local bridges maintenance is to receive £12 million in 2021-22 from the £32 million total. The further commitment costs are largely for the extension to the Strategic Framework Business Support Grants that the First Minister announced on the 23rd of February, together with the smaller items listed in the supporting document that have been firmed up to date, mainly in light of COVID pressures. The costings for the extended non-domestic rates relief and the expanded self-isolation support grant are in line with the respective revised forecasts published on February by the Scottish Fiscal Commission. And in Schedule 1, there are 12 amendments to portfolio level, external body and total allocations, with a further amendment to the overall cash authorisation at Section 4. And Convener, I understand that there will be one minor change in advance of amendments towards the end of this committee session. With your permission, Convener, I'll briefly update the committee on progress regarding negotiations with opposition parties, because I have secured a commitment from the Green Party to support the bill's passage, reflecting today's stage 2 amendment and some further amendments that I intend to lay at stage 3, subject to progress at stage 2. I'm also in continuing discussions with the Liberal Democrats, who had previously secured concessions at stage 1 on mental health, education recovery and business support in exchange for supporting the budget at stage 1. So the main additional commitments as part of the commitment with the Greens will be to, and I list, extend concessionary travel for young people in Scotland to under 22s, that would include 21-year-olds, expand universal provision of free school meals to all primary school children in term time, phased over the next 2 years, increase the cash underpin in the public sector pay policy to £800 up to £25,000 salary, that's from £750, and increase the pay rise to 2% up to £40,000 of salary from 1%. The £100 million anti-poverty funding I announced last month within today's amendments will be used to support a pandemic support payment to support people, in particular families, on low incomes, and an additional £40 million of capital targeted at supporting green recovery and our net zero ambitions. I'll be able to say more at stage 3, but I wanted to take the opportunity to update the committee transparently on this recent development. And if sufficient progress is made with the Liberal Democrats over the course of today, then I will update Parliament tomorrow on that. Convener, I will stop now and I look forward to the committee's questions.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. On the minimum amendment you suggested, I know that the clerks and officials are discussing that as we proceed with this morning's evidence session. It may or may not require us to suspend for a short period at the end of the evidence session before we go into the formal process, but we'll come to that when we reach it. Cabinet Secretary, if I can begin with questions. I just wondered, can you provide the committee with details of the block grant adjustment following the UK budget last week, the extent to which it differs from the provisional block grant adjustment, and how that will impact on the budget for 21-22? Now, you may have covered some of that already, but I think just for the record that would be helpful. And if there's any technical detail you require to follow up with your officials, please feel free to draw them into the discussion.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm happy to follow up with more information because, as you will appreciate, the UK government gave us the option of either using the provisional or the UK budget block grant adjustments as the basis for the 2021-22 budget. Now, the lateness of the UK budget has increased the volatility that we could face. We are still considering the overall impact of the block grant adjustments. We can't cherry pick which block grant adjustments that we like. We have to take it as a whole. So there will be some tax changes that the UK government announced, which may deliver a more positive benefit, but there will be others that have a negative impact. And therefore, once we have the SFC forecasts of tax revenues and social security expenditure published, we will have a fuller picture of what the impact is. So I will follow up to the committee in writing in terms of our final decision on block grant adjustments, but it's likely that we will continue to use the provisional block grant adjustments, not only because it will protect the Scottish budget in the short term, it might mean that we have more negative reconciliations later, but until we're in a position of having fully understood the overall impact of the UK government's announcements, it reduces volatility to choose to use the provisional block grant adjustments. On that one, I don't know if any. Sorry, I wondered if any officials wanted to come in on the detail of that, but otherwise I'll follow up in writing.
No. Convener, it's up to you, Convener. I mean, there's a bit of detail and some underlying numbers about the kind of the overall comparative effect between the provisional BGA and the updated one that we got last week. So it's whether you want that in a follow up or you want some of that now. Or?
Well, given that I think probably a follow-up letter which provides us with the specifics, I think that would be more appropriate. If it's detailed, it's quite difficult in the middle of an evidence session for everyone to understand the flow. So I think follow-up through the letter would be helpful. So finally, Cabinet Secretary, I wrote on behalf of the committee to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury last week in regard to our findings in our budget report. And as you know, the committee recommended that given borrowing costs are an extraordinary low, that the Treasury consider increasing the Scottish Government's capital borrowing powers as a value for money means of supporting economic recovery. And I note from your response to our budget report that you've also written to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury to request that limits imposed on the Scottish Government borrowing and reserve powers are increased. I just wonder, can you update the committee on whether you've received a response yet, and whether your officials are having discussions with Treasury officials on this matter?
Well, we have had conversations with Treasury officials on capital borrowing limits from the very beginning, and to date there has been no indication that additional borrowing powers for capital will be granted to the Scottish Government. I suppose unless there's anything further to come, the short answer is that there hasn't been any movement on capital borrowing. Now, my concerns are twofold. Firstly, we know that in order to drive economic recovery, we need to embark on a comprehensive programme of capital investment. That's why we set out our 5-year capital spending review. And that was based on a 5% cut to our overall capital figures. Now, I was very hopeful that though that cut might have been reversed at the UK government's budget, because we know the importance of capital spending, that it hasn't been reversed. The second concern I have is that it's quite clear from the UK's approach to levelling up funds, and indeed the replacement of new structural funds through the Shared Prosperity Fund, that the UK government intends to invest on a UK-wide basis rather than generating the equivalent Barnett consequentials. I think that's a political choice, it's an ideological choice, but it does mean that the Scottish Government will see less capital funding of its own to invest, and instead the UK Government will leapfrog the Scottish Government to invest directly. That is an issue that has caused huge concern from the Welsh Government as well as the Northern Irish Executive. It's something that we feared would happen, and clearly our fears have been realised in the UK Government's budget. And I think there's been quite a lot of coverage over the weekend as to where that funding will be directed and why.
Okay, there's comments I'd like to make on that, but others may follow up on that, Cabinet Secretary. In the meantime, can I hand over to Murdo Fraser? Murdo, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. A couple of areas I'd like to ask you about, and the first arises from what you've just told us, specifically in relation to the additional funds for an uplift in public sector pay. And when we took evidence from COSLA some weeks ago, they raised their concern that the Scottish Government's pay policy that was announced, if they were to follow that, that would put a substantial additional burden on their resource budget. Given what you just announced about public sector pay, are you putting more money into local government to help them meet the expectation there will be from local government workers that they'll be also getting this 2% if they're paid up to 40,000?
Well, I will certainly engage with COSLA over the substance of the negotiations today. I've already spoken to Gail McGregor about that. But I think it's important that we ensure that local government has an adequate settlement, but then it is for local government to determine how that funding is used as the employers, and it's not for the Scottish Government to tell COSLA how to use its funding and how to cover public sector pay, because ultimately local government are the employers. Now, I have set out over the last few weeks the settlement for local government. That includes over 3% uplift in its core settlement, alongside £259 million for COVID pressures, and then £275 million for COVID pressures. So I will continue to engage with COSLA in terms of the overall settlement, and then it's for local government, quite rightly so, to determine how that funding is used.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that response. I mean, it was clear when COSLA spoke to us they were going to be struggling to even match the 1% increase you'd previously announced. Has the Scottish Government did any costings on the likely impact on local government of this new pay policy?
Well, I think it's really important, and I'm saying this actually on behalf of COSLA and local government, that local government has the freedom to set its own pay policy. Now, if I here tell you precisely how much money is going to local government for pay, that is essentially ring-fencing funding, which is something that all parties are constantly criticising me for. So we understand the overall impact of public sector pay policy. We know that not only will it have an impact on workforces that are subject to the public sector pay policy, but we also know it's a benchmark. It will be a benchmark for workforce negotiations, whether that's in the health service or in amongst teachers or also in local government. So clearly there will be an impact, but ultimately those workforce negotiations are between employers, trade unions and the workforce, and the Scottish Government is not party to workforce negotiations between local government as an employer and the workforce that will be in negotiations on a fair pay.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I ask you a separate question on a slightly different issue, and that's in relation to LBTT, because we've had for the last 12 months a temporary extension to the threshold at which LBTT has been paid. That's been very welcome throughout the period of COVID. You decided in your budget you weren't going to extend that beyond the end of the financial year. Now, the Chancellor in his budget announced that it would be extended in England, which of course will generate Barnett consequentials. I noticed that the Welsh Government had decided to extend their own exemption up until the end of June. Is there any particular reason you took a decision not to extend that tax holiday, you might call it, which I think people in the sector saw as very beneficial in terms of stimulating demand?
Thanks, and it's a very pertinent question, and it's something that I've weighed up really carefully, because ultimately I want to ensure that our tax policies do accelerate economic recovery rather than hinder it. And just on one point, and officials will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that the changes to LBTT necessarily generate consequentials. They will generate block grant adjustments, which of course will then be part of our decision making on whether to go with provisional or final block grant adjustments, but we can't cherry pick those block grant adjustments. So there's probably three factors in arriving at my decision. The first is that this was always designed to help the property market recover. We were clear from the outset that the change was temporary. It was intended to support activity last year. It would end on the 31st of March 2021. And in that period, the property market has recovered. Sales have been at the highest ever level in December, rising 360% since April and 180% since the temporary nil rate ban change was introduced. So there has been recovery. My second point is that recovery was despite the fact that the nil rate ban was at a lower threshold than in the rest of the UK, or at least, in England. So we have seen that recovery despite a lower tax cut, as it were, in Scotland than the rest of the UK. That means that when it comes to the 31st of March, in terms of the cliff edge, I think the calls for extending the nil rate ban have been much stronger in relation to stamp duty, because tax has been reduced by up to £15,000, and there appear to be concerns about the speed with which house purchases are progressing. I'm not aware of similar concerns in Scotland in terms of an overall blockage in the house market, or in terms of the impact that there will be in terms of that cliff edge. There's far more to gain, basically, in England from extending it than there is in Scotland. The last point that I would make is around choices. So, when I look at the need right now amongst the business community and in the Scottish economy for support, the number one ask from businesses has been consistently non-domestic rates. Now, we have chosen to go further in Scotland on non-domestic rates. We've chosen to adopt a 100% rates relief for a full year for more sectors in Scotland. That's a conscious choice, but it all comes from the same budget. And therefore, I think that non-domestic rates relief will do more to support recovery and economic recovery than extending the LBTT nil rate band. Obviously, the last point I'll make before handing back is that for first-time buyers, there will continue to be a higher threshold of the nil rate band.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's a very helpful response. But your answer is based on the assumption that extending the tax relief period would be a cost to the Scottish Government. I was very interested to look at the figures for last year that showed in the period from September the revenue from LBTT was 223 million, which was 39 million more than was generated in the year before, which suggests, in fact, that reducing the threshold level has actually increased the amount of tax that has been brought in. So what modelling have we actually done to show that this change won't actually reduce revenues as opposed to increasing them?
Well, there's two issues I would take with that evidence. The first is that your figures are only based, as you said, from September onwards. So it doesn't take into account LBTT revenues across the year. And I know that there's been some press coverage in terms of this tax change leading to higher LBTT revenues and therefore should be continued. But it is revenue data that's based from the third quarter onwards rather than the whole year to date, and we do need to compare the years because we know that there was a lot of pent-up demand because of lockdown coming to an end in the summer. So we've got to take into account that pent-up demand. But the second part to this is if you compare the housing market in Scotland and England, in Scotland we have seen record high levels of transactions and record high levels of LBTT revenues. That's despite the fact that the nil rate ban threshold is half what it is in England. In other words, we have seen an equal recovery despite the tax threshold being lower. Now, if last June, or July rather, I had done what the UK government had done and given a tax cut to a buoyant market, then that would not have been a great use of our budget. I have got to use that budget in ways that genuinely do improve our economic recovery, that rather than giving tax cuts to what is a buoyant market.
Okay, I'm sure we could pursue this further, but I'm happy to leave it for now. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Murdo. John Mason, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. If I can pursue LBTT, I just wonder if part of your thinking, Cabinet Secretary, is also that we need to target those most in need. And in a constituency like mine, I mean, in the first place, many people don't own their own houses, so any tax holiday doesn't help them. And secondly, a lot of houses, I mean, the flats in the estate where I live are going for about 70,000. So any tax break would not help these people at the kind of lower end of the scale. So I just wonder if that's part of your thinking as well.
It is part of our thinking. So in terms of supporting first-time buyers specifically, I don't think that LBTT and cuts to LBTT on their own support first-time buyers. Now, we have a first-time buyer relief in place that increases the nil rate ban to 175,000, meaning that first-time buyers save up to £600 in tax. But that sits alongside a number of policy initiatives to support first-time buyers. And indeed, I saw the Chancellor taking a leaf out of our book in terms of supporting first-time buyers with deposits, which is something that we already had in Scotland. So I think that using LBTT in isolation is a very blunt tool and actually in some cases risks pushing the property prices higher rather than helping first-time buyers get on the housing ladder. But the other part that John Mason talked about was the average cost of a house in Scotland. And that's, of course, we, by having a threshold at 250,000, still took 8 out of 10 properties out of paying tax. Now that tells you a lot about the average property market, average housing price, in Scotland, and also the fact that there are some areas where the thought of even getting to a property price of 250 is so outside the realms of possibility. And our position is to help as many people as possible get on the housing ladder or at least have a safe, secure, warm home. And that goes alongside all the other initiatives that arguably are more important, like building affordable and social houses.
That's great. Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. I've got a couple of points just from your letter of the 2nd of March, which you referred to earlier on. In one of your points in response to the committee's comments, you said, without full devolution of tax powers, as we've called for, our ability to respond to Scotland-specific risks will always be very limited. Can you expand a little on that? How are the limited tax powers restricting us?
Well, I'd answer in two ways. The first is we've seen over the last few years, since more taxes have been devolved, that there is an interplay between devolved taxes and reserve taxes. We saw that in terms of the effective tax rate, the marginal tax rate for some taxpayers when it comes to income tax and national insurance contributions. We see that when it comes to supporting the economy, where the only arguably business tax we have, and it's not a business tax, it's just a non-domestic rates tax, is non-domestic rates. So I think what we've seen during the pandemic is when it comes to managing risk, you need a toolbox of different taxes to try and support people. And secondly, when you only have one tax, say one business tax, it's a very, very blunt instrument, and it doesn't allow for nuance that's needed when it comes to the pandemic's impact on Scotland. We've seen economically that some businesses have actually fared relatively well in the pandemic. We've seen supermarkets, we've seen the impact on tech businesses. They've done relatively well. Other businesses are on their knees, and yet because we only have really one business tax, non-domestic rates, we can't nuance it sufficiently to help those that are in need, whilst also continuing to take revenue from those that don't need a tax cut. So those would be my two answers, that in terms of managing recovery, we need a mix of taxes, and secondly, we know that there's an interplay between reserved and devolved taxes, which is not helpful to Scottish taxpayers. So to manage the risks and the shocks to the Scottish economy, we need a broader range of tools.
Again, thanks for that answer. And my third and final one would be, again, in your letter you touch on the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and the convener mentioned that as well. I mean, I just wonder if you have any more indications from the UK government as to where that's going. And is there a danger that, for example, we want to move to more active travel and public transport, and we could be investing in railways and they could be investing in roads, and there would be a clash of priorities there? Is that one of the risks?
I think that is a risk. In terms of the Shared Prosperity Fund, we obviously have it on record that the UK government intends to manage it. We've seen what they've done on the Levelling Up funds, which seems a bizarre methodology. Well, I don't believe it's published yet, unless anybody's seen it. I certainly haven't. A bizarre methodology to allocate capital funding to certain areas and not other areas. Now, as somebody who's speaking to you from what I like to call the epicentre of civilization, also known as Dingwall in the Highlands, in a region that has benefited enormously from EU structural funds, there's very few local rural roads that you drive down without seeing funded by EU structural funding. We know that regions like this have benefited enormously from the EU structural funds, and yet I don't see a significant increase in capital funding coming from the UK government to replace what's being removed by Brexit. So my view is that you're absolutely right, that the UK government will take choices, make decisions about where to invest for what appears to be pretty political purposes, and yet it does not necessarily reflect the priorities of the people of that area. I know that the hospitals, the schools that need capital investment, we're committed to investing in those schools and those hospitals. We'll wait and see if the UK government does similarly.
Thanks very much. Thanks, convener.
Thank you, John. Daniel Johnson, please.
Thank you very much, convener. I think we've all been noting with interest the row that has been sparked following the UK budget regarding pay for nurses. I mean, I think the one thing that the pandemic has done is underline, I think, the fact that the burden for the pandemic has not fallen equally on everyone's shoulders, and there have been people very much at the front line shouldering more of the burden than others, and indeed that 1% simply didn't reflect, I think, that the value and worth of the work that nurses have been doing. Just wondering if that row had caused the Scottish Government to reflect somewhat. Obviously, we've heard this morning about 2% pay increase for public sector workers, but is there a case for looking specifically at certain workers and whether or not they actually deserve more because of not just for the work they've been doing, but actually the critical role they play in building resilience into public services, because COVID's not going away. So do nurses deserve more than 1%? Do they deserve more than 2%?
Well, I would agree with the sentiment of Daniel Johnson's question. And for those either watching this evidence or looking at our public sector pay policy, I would remind everybody that the public sector pay policy does not apply to a number of different workforces, including those that work in the NHS, because there will be separate pay deal negotiations within the NHS. And whilst the public sector pay policy acts as a benchmark, there are still separate negotiations between trade unions and employers and the workforce. In terms of the public sector pay policy that we have adopted, though, I would unequivocally say that it is more generous and tries to balance the need to recognise our public sector workers, not just with rounds of applause, but with fair remuneration, alongside the challenges of affordability. So we have talked today about a guaranteed cash underpin of £800, and that compares with £250 south of the border. We've introduced a 1%, a 2% threshold as well to try and smooth the curve in terms of funding through the public sector pay policy, and we are committed to pay at least the real living wage of £9.50, which will be an increase of 2.2%. So I agree with the sentiment of Daniel Johnson's question. Not all answers will be given today because those workforce negotiations still have to take place over the coming months, and the public sector pay policy sets the benchmark, but it's not the final destination.
So just briefly, can the Cabinet Secretary just confirm that just a few days ago the Scottish Government confirmed that nurses would be just getting a 1% pay rise, albeit on an interim basis? Is she saying that's not the case, or is she going to be announcing an update on that interim pay settlement?
That precedes the workforce negotiations. So NHS Agenda for Change, NHS doctors and dentists, local government, including teachers and social workers, police officers, firefighters, colleges in Scotland, they will use the public sector pay policy as a benchmark, as a reference point, but the proper substantial negotiations still have to take place.
So it is just 1%. That's fine. Could I just ask about other workers that have been playing a critical role? And she won't be surprised to hear me bring up the pay for those working in social care. The median pay for social care workers is just £9.50 an hour. Now, first of all, does she feel that that reflects the value of the work? But more importantly, and again, speaking to the resilience that we must bake in to our public services, does she think that actually there is a role for them to play, but actually, indeed, savings that they can make if they are performing their job as well as they can, and that, frankly, is dependent on pay? Could you maybe make some comments about what we need to do in terms of improving the pay of social care workers?
Yes, I can, and this is featured in budget discussions. And I said at my stage one budget statement that I was very keen in exploring everything possible to support social care workers more. Now, our commitment is right now that we will implement a collective bargaining approach, and that we are agreed that we will adopt the recommendations that emerge through collective bargaining with trade unions. Now, that is a substantial shift in position, because it is saying that we will sign up to the outcome of that collective bargaining. And I think it's a fundamental step in the right direction as part of the move to a national care service. Right now, I've outlined already that the living wage that we are paying is higher than it is elsewhere. I would like to go further. I would like to consider this as part of workforce negotiations. And right now, when it comes to ensuring that there's funding in place, that we've got to do it properly, we've got to do it well. There are workforces in the public sector, private sector, and the voluntary sector. At the moment, the Scottish Government provides funding for those workers in the private sector. I think we need to get a more sustainable approach to ensure that social care workers in each of those sectors have a fair wage, and we will do that and implement that as part of the approach to collective bargaining.
just finally, just really think that the living wage is sufficient pay for people doing such a critical role? And surely we could just bypass those negotiations, given that there's a very clear claim and call being made by the GMB for £15 an hour. Surely that's a pretty straightforward position, and one that she could address right now in the budget.
Well, I have to make sure that everything is affordable. Bluntly, everything is affordable. And we have to make sure that our priorities can be implemented. I don't dispute the importance of fair remuneration, but I have to make sure, as somebody who's required to balance the budget, that we can implement what we promise to do. When it comes to increase in pay, £15 per hour is about equivalent to an increase in salary of up to £30,000 a year. That will have a knock-on impact on other workforces, particularly nurses in our NHS. So this can't just be plucked out of the hat. It needs to be affordable, it needs to be implemented, and that's why our approach to collective bargaining is one that we have wholeheartedly endorsed, and there's a process there that I think we need to honour.
I'll leave it there, Convener.
Can I just check that the noise that's going outside my house right now is not interfering with anybody's sound quality? There's a gentleman using a digger machine. Okay, can I ask you, is it interfering with your hearing me here? Okay, is it okay?
No, I can hear it vaguely, but it's not right. Interrupting, it's not disturbing.
Okay, good. Patrick Harvey, please.
Thank you, Convener. Speaking here from Dumbarton Road in Partick, that's usually the problem that I have, is background noise. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I was going to pursue some of the same issues as Daniel Johnson on public sector pay, and in particular, when the public sector pay policy from the Scottish Government was originally announced, it was, I think, quite accurately described in relation to the NHS as an interim settlement, because that NHS pay review is still due, as indeed negotiations will take place on a range of other sectoral bases in the future. It does strike me as a little startling if Labour's position is now that, as we've just heard, collective bargaining negotiations should be bypassed. Can I just clarify my understanding that what you've announced today, following discussions with the Scottish Greens, is an enhanced position which will still be an interim position ahead of those sectoral negotiations such as the NHS Scotland pay review, that it's an enhanced interim position, and that the collective bargaining negotiations which take place still have the importance that they deserve to have, and that I would like to have thought most political parties would support.
Yeah, I would hope that most political parties support that approach to collective bargaining as well. And Patrick Harvey is right in characterising the commitment that we have made today on public sector pay policy is a significantly enhanced position. It increases the underpin to £800, and it also increases the pay rise to 2%, up to a £40,000 salary, up from 1%. But he's right, this acts as a reference point, and there are a number of pay deals that are up for negotiation over the coming months. Now, that's for my colleagues, whether it's the Cabinet Secretary for Health to take a lead on, or the equivalent colleagues in other areas, or indeed, as Murdo Fraser said at the outset, or for local government, where there are different employers. So yes, particularly on health and social care, I think most people will be watching with interest as to what the final settlement is for our health and social care workforce who have been on the front line. And the approach to collective bargaining with the care sector in particular is new, and it is hopefully an indication of the respect that we hold the social care workforce with.
And the backdrop to this, of course, is that for a significant number of years now, Scotland has attempted to have a better public sector pay approach than the UK, which has been much closer to a freeze in a significant number of recent years. So given that historic difference and the fact that there's a progressive approach being taken with that underpin effectively amounting to well over 4% at the bottom end of the pay scale, a new teaching assistant, for example, it would represent well over 4%. For a starting nurse, it would be approaching 4%. Those changes mean that Scotland is going to be in a position with not only significantly better public sector pay, given that historic context, but significantly better in terms of the equality of public sector pay and closing the pay gap.
Absolutely. So we have taken a more progressive approach, and the commitment that we've reached today with the Green Party makes that more progressive and fairer as well for those who are earning less. So for context, a staff nurse at the top of band 5, which is the majority of staff nurses, is on a salary of 31.6k. Senior nurses at the top of band 6 are on a salary of about £39,000. Today we have announced a public sector pay policy which sees that underpin of £800, which, as you say, is substantially more, and also an increase in pay by 2% up to a threshold of £40,000. So that, even though the NHS workforce will still be subject to separate negotiations, and this just acts as a benchmark, I hope that indicates the importance that we place on those on the front line and recognising their efforts, not just with a round of applause, but also with a fairer approach to pay.
And finally, I just wanted to ask on the capital side. Obviously, there's a number of issues that have been talked about, including public transport, agri-environment schemes, energy efficiency, use of the town centres fund to support sustainable transport as well. The phrase green recovery is very easy to throw around, and I think a lot of governments are talking about green recovery, but perhaps not yet quite defining how that's going to shape economic recovery from COVID. How would you describe the place of the concept of green recovery within the Scottish Government's plans, and if there are further consequentials when the UK Government decides how it's going to define its economic recovery plan, of which there wasn't very much in the UK budget, how do you intend to continue to try and ensure that all political parties can feed into those discussions, given that in-year budget revisions, as we've seen in the past, tend to involve less in the way of inter-party and parliamentary scrutiny?
Well, I start this answer by not just recognising the importance of investing in low-carbon initiatives, but also recognising the fact that we have very ambitious, very challenging targets when it comes to transitioning to net zero. And we have to ensure that every penny we invest is helping us to reach those targets, because they are extremely difficult targets. And that's where in the capital spending review, you see that the 5-year commitment of an additional £2 billion of low carbon investment through the low carbon fund. Now, just bluntly, if that £2 billion is going on low carbon investment, it's not going on high carbon investment. And ensuring that the £1.6 billion to transform heat and energy efficiency of buildings over 5 years is supported as well, not just because it helps to meet our targets, but also because in terms of revitalising the economy and making those investments, we have choices. We can either choose to invest in a way that helps us transition to net zero, or invest in a way that makes it more difficult. And I think that the approach that we've taken demonstrates our commitment to using money in a way that does boost that transition rather than hinders it. But of course, the focus of this committee session is on next year. And next year as well, we saw in my statement on the 16th of February, in recognition of the Greens' priority of energy efficiency, an additional £45 million for energy efficiency next year. And in today's comments, I've also announced an additional £40 million capital targeted at supporting green recovery and our net zero ambitions. So in the short term, there is additional capital out of a very challenging capital settlement, and over the next 5 years, hopefully you will see that investment continue and grow in an effort to meet our ambitious targets.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Patrick. Alistair Allen, please.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you've identified, I think, £90 million to go towards supporting local authorities with the council tax freeze. Can I ask you what assessment has been made of that figure, and are you satisfied it's a robust figure to cover those costs, and also outline what kind of options local authorities have, given that you've indicated they'll have some options about this?
Yeah, so that £90 million is the equivalent of what councils would have raised with a 3% increase to council tax. So it is a robust figure. I'm not aware of any dispute on that £90 million reflecting what councils might have been able to raise if they had increased council tax by 3%. So it's a robust figure, and what it allows us to do is to support household incomes, as well as ensuring that from council tax perspective, there's no detriment to services, because councils can draw down on that funding. It is a choice for them. So I have said that there's no absolute commitment requirement, but councils can choose to compensate a freeze on council tax by making use of that £90 million fund.
And how does that? How does this policy option affect people in differing income brackets? For instance, do you feel that it's likely to affect this or other measures, indeed, for local authorities, are likely to benefit people on lower incomes?
Well, yes, the council tax freeze has to be seen alongside the council tax reduction scheme. So the council tax reduction scheme explicitly supports it supports around 500,000 low-income households from local tax liabilities that they would not have been able to meet. And whilst there's much dispute and debate around how to make council tax more progressive and fairer, the council tax reduction scheme does do that because it supports low-income households. And we saw an increase in applications for the council tax reduction scheme over the pandemic, indicating that those that are in need are making use of it. Alongside that, the council tax freeze helps countless families, some of whom have been working from home, some of whom have seen their household bills increase in terms of energy bills increase, other utilities bills increase. And for a year, I think if we're helping businesses with their tax, we should help households with their tax bills as well.
Finally, Convener, what assessment have you made of the pressures which local authorities identify existing on their budgets just now as a consequence of the COVID crisis? Have you anything you can say about how you feel the government can or should be involved in that?
Yeah, so I think local government have done a sterling job over the last year. They've been on the front line, and the settlement reflects that point. So the settlement needs to be looked at in terms of the funding for core services, and there will be a 3.1% funding increase for local revenue services. That's the sort of cash for local government day-to-day spending. But alongside that, yes, there have been COVID-related pressures on local government, and that's why I initially announced £259 million of non-recurring COVID consequentials. It's not ring-fenced. There are no strings attached. They can use that funding to address COVID-19 pressures, and that has now been agreed with COSLA. Then on the 16th of February, I increased the funding to local government by £275 million. Again, that's no strings attached. It's not ring-fenced. They can use that for the COVID pressures that they are facing. So, overall, that is a fair settlement to local government, and it recognises the particular pressures that are on local government. And we have now agreed the distribution of those funding streams with COSLA.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Alistair Allen. Jackie Baillie, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. Can I start with the council tax freeze and then move on to pay? Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, is it her intention to build in the £90 million into local government's baseline so that they're not having to start off the new financial year having to find 3% before they do anything else in their budget?
Well, as Jackie Bailey will know, seeing as we're still not through stage 2 or stage 3 of this year's budget, I'm unlikely to start setting next year's budget, and we will consider all these matters in negotiations with COSLA in next year's budget. What I would say, though, is that we want to ensure that there are fair settlements for local government, not just this year, but next year. And also, it's unlikely next year that the Scottish Government will be in receipt of substantially more in COVID consequential funding. So it's likely that next year's budget could even be more challenging than this year's budget. So we will have to weigh all these matters up and come to a conclusion with COSLA.
I wasn't asking the Cabinet Secretary to reflect on next year's budget. The ability to build it into the baseline is available to her in this year's budget, and that avoids any problems in the future. However, let me move on. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary some general questions about how much of the substantial increase in budget she is now enjoying is recurring funding, how much is non-recurring, and how much of the COVID funding for this year is she carrying forward into next?
So in answer to the second question, I am carrying forward all of the late consequentials. So that's £1.1 billion. That was announced at the UK supplementary estimates, notified to us in the last week or so. That will be carried over into next year, out with the reserve, which is what the Welsh Government and the Northern Irish Government are doing, because they will be of more use next year. In terms of the additional funding this year, there is net consequentials of 1.175 billion resource. The vast majority of that is COVID related, so it's non-recurring. Of the recurring amount, it's negligible. And again, I think I could provide a bit more information on that through letter, because it's quite complex in terms of what has been deducted and what has been added. But in the recurring space of the 1.175, it's about £9 million that is in the recurring space, largely related to education.
But there was, if I'm correct, an uplift that was recurring of your main budget just shy of £1 billion. Would that be right?
So announced at the UK Government spending review, there was 1.3 billion, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, 1.3 billion pounds in terms of, I can find it for her precisely what it was that was additional, and if I can't find it now, I will write to the committee on precisely what was given to us. That was recurring funding.
Thank you, that's helpful. It is a substantial uplift by anybody's reckoning. Can I ask you about the interim 1% for nurses' pay? How much has been set aside in the budget if nurses' pay exceeds 1%?
The health portfolio will absorb those costs, and the health portfolio are very mindful of the fact that negotiations are upcoming. There has been a lot of conversations with unions. I understand that that agreement has not been reached, but we know that funding will need to be sourced to cover that. But that is not held corporately, that is held within the health portfolio.
Okay, but in order to do a deal with another political party, you will have had to assess the cost of doing so. Now, how much is that enhanced public sector pay deal from which it will be a framework for certainly nurses' pay?
It's approximately, but I stress approximately because the Public Sector Pay Policy acts as a reference point, it's approximately equivalent to 100 million.
So actually that's not such a huge sum when you consider the number of public sector workers that there are in Scotland.
That's right, because I think sometimes people forget that the public sector pay policy doesn't apply to many of the workforces that we are most interested in when it comes to public and press coverage. So, for example, it acts as a benchmark, but it does not directly apply to Agenda for Change, to NHS workers, for example. It does not directly apply to local government, but it's used as a benchmark, and then employers negotiate with their workforces on what the final settlement will be for those workforces.
Sure, but it is a very helpful guide, and that usually determines where public sector pay ends up. Can I, for the record, indicate that Labour supports collective bargaining? Of course we do, but we don't regard it as, an either-or option to putting in place a substantial pay increase for social care workers. And you would expect me to say this, but particularly on International Women's Day, there is an opportunity to create a step change in pay for this sector, which is largely, female and low paid. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, why she rejected Labour's very reasonable approach that said, we want £15 an hour, but we'll accept £12 an hour as an immediate uplift, with a process in place to review that, much akin to collective bargaining?
Well, I did appreciate the constructive approach from the Labour Party, and spent a considerable amount of time doing the sums, figuring out what might be possible, because I agree with the sentiment wholeheartedly of wanting to provide support to our carers, many of whom were forgotten about until it came to the pandemic, and then we realised just how much we depended on them. The reasons that I would give, and of course I'm saying all this from a starting position of providing a much more generous living wage benchmark across the care workforce in Scotland than elsewhere. But the several things I'd say in response is, in terms of the funding, there are many things I would like to do, but I need to have the funding available. Public sector pay freeze south of the border has a material impact. But when it comes to our carers, essentially what the GMB were asking for in terms of the £15 an hour actually equates to just over a £29,000 salary every year. That's up from a £19,500 salary, which is what would be the equivalent of £10 per hour. So that is a substantial increase in pay, and it is the equivalent of about 58% increase in pay. Now that we know there are workforces in the public, the private and the voluntary sector, which the Scottish Government would have to give due consideration to help them afford those increases. And we also know that there would be an impact on sort of bands 1 to 5 in the NHS workforce as well, the Agenda for Change. So the implications in terms of affordability are quite substantial and significant. It could cost over £2 billion to implement that £15 per hour. Now, obviously, doing an increase to £12 per hour is less, but it is still substantially more than the funding that we have available. Now, people often talk about the huge increases in funding that the Scottish Government has seen this year. All of that is related to COVID. So it's COVID consequentials. That means that they are non-recurring. So we get them 1 year with no guarantee that they'll come the following years. In fact, they won't come the following years. And therefore, pay has to be afforded out of our recurring funding, because pay is by its nature recurring. And so to use COVID consequentials to the tune of £500 million without guarantee that it will be forthcoming next year is just not a risk that I can take right now. But I do agree that we will implement what is recommended through collective bargaining, and it's this government that has taken steps to put in place collective bargaining. I wouldn't want to undermine collective bargaining, but I would say that we are committed to implementing what comes from collective bargaining in the care sector.
Can I simply note that the Cabinet Secretary told us earlier that she had 1.3 billion in recurring monies in this budget, so it could have been afforded. Thank you, Convener.
Well, I'll leave the Cabinet Secretary to decide whether she makes a comment on that comment when she answers Dean Lockhart's questions, who we now come to. Dean.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned earlier EU structural funds, and if you look at Table 704 of the budget, which deals with spending plans under the EU structural funds, the table is blank for the period 2019 to 2022, reflecting the fact that, as you will know, the EU structural funds have been suspended since 2019 because of non-compliance by the Scottish Government. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that as a result of that suspension of EU funds, more than £100 million has been decommitted, in other words, lost to the Scottish budget?
I think that is a remarkable question from Dean Lockhart, considering the EU structural funds are going to now be suspended for time immemorial on the basis of what his government and his party have subjected Scotland to in removing us from the EU. So Dean Lockhart's full outrage when it comes to EU structural funding is misplaced, because when it comes to EU structural funding, we know how much our communities, how much our capital infrastructure has benefited from the EU. We know that the promises to replace that in terms of there being no detriment to Scotland have been broken. We know the fact that our fishermen, our farmers, our crofters will not see a like-for-like replacement in funding as a result of being taken out of the EU. We also know that every one of the devolved governments will no longer be in charge of distributing that capital funding to reflect the priorities of the people of Scotland or the people of Wales or the people of Northern Ireland, because the UK government has chosen to take the powers themselves and using the levelling up funds, which we know are to benefit the northeast of England, Scotland will lose out on that kind of funding. So we will manage our own internal requirements when it comes to EU structural funding, and he will know, if he was listening last week, that there has been no detriment as a result of the point he's made to the communities that depend on that funding. There will be a huge detriment to those communities as a result of EU structural funding completely drying out, not because of the way that the people of Scotland voted, but because of a political decision taken by his government.
Well, I'm not sure you answered my question there, Cabinet Secretary, and I'm sure you'll be glad to hear that the UK government has committed to replace the EU funds in full, and I'm sure they won't be decommitted or lost in the manner that the EU funding seems to be lost. But can you confirm, just in response to my question, that the EU funds have been in suspension and no funds have been available since 2019, and that this amounts to over £100 million in lost funding?
Well, it's not quite as simple as that, and I'm happy to write to Dean Lockhart with more information. We have been working with the EU to ensure that the processes in place meet their standards, but when it comes to supporting the community groups and those that depend on the funding, we have ensured that there is funding available to them. So it's a question about how the process between ourselves and the EU, rather than between the Scottish Government and the communities that rely on that funding.
That would be great if you could confirm in writing, Cabinet Secretary. Also on this point, there have been reports the EU Commission may impose penalties on the Scottish Government as a result of the non-compliance. Penalties of up to £190 million have been reported. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether she's aware of any potential penalties that may be imposed by the EU Commission? And has the Cabinet Secretary provided for any contingent liabilities or other accounting adjustments in the budget to deal with the suspension of the EU programme?
I'm not, but I can add that to the letter. I know that this was something that Ivan McKee in particular was working on about a year and a half ago. It's only relatively recently been in the public domain in terms of newspapers, so I will make sure that we've got the latest information to share with Dean Lockhart as a result of this session.
That would be helpful. But in general terms, the reality is the Scottish Government has had to step in and use taxpayers' money to replace EU funds that have been lost. Is that right, from a general perspective?
There's a slight difference in money being lost and the process being temporarily suspended. And I would advise that that's quite an important distinction to make. There's work ongoing. A lot of that work has come to a conclusion, but there is work ongoing in terms of the processes and making sure that all parties are happy with the process, but that does not necessarily mean that money has been lost.
Okay, I look forward to your response on that, Cabinet Secretary. If I may turn to another matter, the budget of the Scottish National Investment Bank, which we've discussed before. Over the past 2 years, if you look at Table 701 of the budget, the bank has been allocated a total of £370 million. But according to a parliamentary answer I received last week, less than 15% of this budget has been invested by the bank, meaning that £320 million of the bank budget has not been invested. Given, obviously, the huge demand for emergency funding from firms that are struggling as a result of the pandemic, can you explain why the vast majority of the bank's budget has yet to be spent?
Well, the bank only became operational in November last year. The bank is the single biggest economic development in the history of the Scottish Parliament. It has already made steps in terms of doing deals, but it has only become operational last November. And by operational, I mean recruiting the team, recruiting the staff, putting in place a chief executive. They've made a very good start. They have got £200 million in fresh capital for investment next year. So, in terms of the process of being established, that funding was important. But what's really important is that there's funding in place for them to start investing and that they are now operational.
Okay, final question on this. I appreciate the bank's only been operational for four months or so, but I would imagine, would it not be relatively easy and certainly quick to identify a stream of funding from the bank's budget that could be immediately available for the thousands of firms that are struggling as a result of the pandemic? Or is it a conscious policy decision not to use the bank's budget to help firms who are struggling as a result of the pandemic?
Well, I think that question misunderstands on two fronts the role of the bank. So, of course, the bank has been set up independent of Scottish ministers, and while Scottish ministers like telling a whole host of different public bodies what their priorities are and what to do, the bank is by necessity independent and makes its own decisions when it comes to investment. Of course, it's mission-led. It's got a primary mission to help provide investment needed to put business at the forefront of driving forward our net zero ambitions, but it is independent of Scottish ministers. The second point I would make is that when it comes to investment, I do want to see a step change in economic growth. I want to see the bank powering innovation and accelerating the move to sort of high-tech, globally competitive and an inclusive economy. So that's important. That doesn't mean to say that we aren't supporting businesses that are struggling. We are. We've done that through the pandemic. We've largely used our enterprise agencies, which the bank doesn't replace, as well as local government when it comes to those survival grants. And those survival grants will continue until the Scottish economy is back open and trading. So I think there's a slight distinction that's necessary there in A, who tells the bank what to do, and B, what the bank's role is when it comes to delivering a step change in Scottish economic growth.
And finally, the bank has for this financial year a budget of £240 million. It looks like roughly £190 million of that will be unspent, given we're close to the end of the financial year. What will happen to that £190 million of budget that the bank has not been able to spend this financial year? Is that going to be rolled over, and is that part of the budget line item we see for the next financial year?
Not explicitly. So I think I'm back at committee on Wednesday, if I remember correctly, with the spring budget revision, and that will give the final figures of spend for each budget line this year. It will take into account the most recent consequentials, and it will take into account where there has been some lower demand than expected and where that money has been reutilised. No money sits there unused. In terms of our overall budget management, every year we're constantly trying to ensure that we get the most out of every penny. And that means if there is budget available, we can redeploy that. We saw that in the autumn budget revision or the summer budget revision, where there was some unspent FTs, and we used those FTs to support loans to, I think in that case it was to landlords that were struggling in the housing sector. So we have reused and reutilised funding throughout the pandemic, And the nature of this pandemic is that we've had to work very quickly to redeploy funding so that it is used for those that are most in need.
Thank you very much. Convener, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Dean. Fulton McGregor, please.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, you've already, as has already been outlined, the Scottish Government have went further than the UK Government by extending 100% non-domestic rates relief for retail, hospitality, leisure and aviation for 12 months. I'm wondering if you can take the opportunity to explain the Government's thinking behind this very welcome move, but given that there is that disparity between the two governments, what was your thinking behind it moving forward?
Thanks for that. So the reason I did it was because it was the #1 ask from businesses in terms of support next year. I know that even when businesses start trading, when the economy opens up, we want to support businesses as much as possible to recover. And if we can reduce the tax burden for a year whilst they recover, then hopefully that will allow them to keep on staff, to help with start-up costs, and we will revisit this policy at this time next year. So that's why I extended it. The reason I extended it before the UK Government's budget was to provide certainty. We are nearing the end of the financial year. Businesses are making decisions right now about what funding they have available. And so I wanted to give them as much early notice as possible. And that meant I had to take a bit of a risk by announcing it before the UK Government. Now, the UK Government has announced it. They aren't going as far as we are in terms of 100% for a full year, but I remain committed to that policy, having given reassurance to businesses that they will not pay non-domestic rates next year, and so that remains my position. But it does mean inevitably that where funding does not completely cover our policy choices, we have to make decisions about what we prioritise and what we don't prioritise.
Yeah, and I think that the decisions that you have made will be very welcome by businesses. You talked earlier about the grants that have been in place, and I've said before in a previous committee session, I want to thank how good North Lanarkshire Council's grant team have been. They've been absolutely fantastic. These grants have helped local businesses in my constituency and across the country. You talked about them continuing until the economy is bounced back, if you like. I wonder if you can explain what that means. Will these grants continue until the economy opens for a certain sector, or will they continue in some form until the economy is back at pre-pandemic levels? Because what you might get is you might get certain businesses being able to open at some point over the next couple of months, but customers using those businesses not quite going back to the same levels for some time after. I wonder if that's been given any thought in the budget plan.
Yeah, it's something that I have given a lot of thought to, and businesses have been quite clear that one of their fears is that when we transition out of lockdown, so when an area goes from level 4 to a lower tier, the closure grants stop. So what we have committed to is essentially a transition or a lag payment where a business will continue to receive the £2,000 or the £3,000 for up to 4 weeks after they come out of level 4, out of closure. So they will receive the grant for up to 4 weeks after they are allowed to open to try and help with those costs. Now, one of the challenges, which I know I sound like I say all the time, but is that the UK Government's done something different. They have chosen to conclude the grants at the end of March and to pay a big top-up grant or a big restart grant in April. That's a different approach, and I will be working with the business organisations to understand what their preferences and what is important to them in terms of either ongoing grants or one big restart grant. Inevitably, it means that the consequentials that have been generated by the UK Government's policy don't go as far as we would like. It doesn't cover our commitment to extend the Strategic Framework Business Fund indefinitely, so we will need to make decisions about that alongside the additional funding that we need to put into extending the non-domestic rates relief.
And can I ask on that point if the expected extension of the grants for a period after opening and the UK Government's one-off grant payment? Are they roughly in the same ballpark in terms of value?
They're not. The restart grants generate consequentials that are less than what we would need to continue the strategic framework business fund up until, for example, June.
Okay. And staying on that line of questioning, Cabinet Secretary, I've asked you before, and I think you'd probably expect me to ask again here today, about businesses which might not open for some time, even when we start to come out of lockdown, not restricted to, but for example, the two main examples are nightclubs and soft plays, which have obviously received funding recently. Have they been factored into in businesses like them? Have they been factored into the budget equations? Given that even when restrictions lift, to some extent these businesses might not get to reopen for some time, given their very nature. Is that something that's been factored in?
Well, it's why we originally said that we would continue the Strategic Framework Business Fund whilst businesses were in lockdown. Unfortunately, the consequentials that have been generated last week only generated as a result of the UK government paying one grant in April. So it does hinder what else we can do on business support. Our approach has been to try and reach as many of the unreached or the excluded as possible by putting in place additional bespoke schemes. In fact, we had about 30, which seemed to be criticised for having too many, followed by requests for having more. So we take all of that into account. We know that some businesses will be closed for longer. We want to ensure that funding is available for as long as it is needed, but the consequential funding generated by the scheme south of the border is lower than I had anticipated.
Okay, thanks for that, Cabinet Secretary. Very helpful. That's me, Convener.
Thank you. Okay, Fulton. Alexander Burnett, please. Sorry, Alexander, apologies. I've just seen that Daniel had put in an R. Forgive me. It was obviously a supplementary. Daniel, was that a supplementary?
Yes, it is, Convener, and thank you for taking it.
Sorry,
I think Fulton McGregor highlights a very important point about different sectors. And I just remind the committee of my register of interest in that I'm a director of a company with albeit remote, but retail interest. Given what we're now discovering about the virus, about new variants, and indeed the fact that we may well end up in a situation where booster vaccinations will be required in order to provide cover, social distancing looks very likely to be with us for some time. That may make some particular sectors, not just that they'll come out of lockdown later, but actually whether or not they're feasible at all while the virus is endemic within the community. Is the government doing any work to look at the potential impact of that, identifying the particular sectors, and will the government come forward with the insights that it provides, and indeed the consequent financial requirements that will entail?
It's a very good question, and I think it's been an issue from the very beginning in terms of some sectors being harder hit, and even the costs of ensuring that their business premises is able to manage that. I am very, very mindful that some businesses are going to face an impact on their trade for longer than others. And that's where my position was, to try and keep those grants going for as long as possible. And particularly the point I mentioned about the lag or the transition grants, where a business would receive funding for up to 4 weeks after it's allowed to reopen, is recognising the fact that even when it's allowed to reopen, there may be additional costs associated with social distancing. There might be additional ongoing costs associated with not being able to get as much trade because space is constrained, or there might just be ongoing confidence issues amongst consumers about returning. So that was the purpose of those lag or transition payments. In terms of what we do to review it, we have very regular meetings with business organisations, the Scottish Retail Consortium being an obvious one, the Scottish Tourism Alliance being another one. They meet with officials and ministers on a weekly or more basis to understand that, and they have been very active when it comes to informing the strategic framework itself about how we reopen, because how we reopen will have an impact on the funding required. I go back to the position though, which is I know that grants provided to date don't go anywhere near compensating lost income. That's been the position from the very beginning. There are some businesses that we continue to provide funding to. We've topped up their funds, and there are other businesses that haven't had anything. So we're constantly in that tension about trying to help those that have had nothing, alongside topping up funds that have already gone out, which don't go anywhere near compensating lost income. And we've got a real challenge right now to know, is the priority ongoing funds, or is the priority one big restart grant? And we're working with the business organisations to understand what their preference would be.
Okay, I'm going to go to Alexander Burnett. And Alexander, sorry, I know you've been waiting some time to ask your questions, and I just made it even longer for you by allowing Daniel to come in. Hope you'll forgive me.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you, convener. My question follows on from that area and what Fulton McGregor was talking about, and what you mentioned in terms of trying to support businesses for which you've been unable to give anything so far. And as a selection of constituents who are still in serious trouble. Outside caterers are receiving nothing, despite being ratepayers with a trading history, and they're being passed pillar to post, with councils saying it's up to the government, and government, including yourself, in responses to me, saying it's up to councils. Bus operators are being treated differently across councils. They're only able to rely on John Swinney saying there was an expectation of fair treatment, and similarly, garden centres are now having to raise appeals to get similar treatment to other council areas. So can I just ask, what support can you offer those still falling through the cracks, and those suffering from what is a postcode lottery of criteria ultimately approved by your government?
Well, we have tried to put in place, as I said, the ongoing blanket support through the Strategic Framework Business Fund, £2,000 every 4 weeks. Do I think it comes anywhere near compensating lost income? No, I don't. But it is in line with the rest of the UK, or it's at least in line with England. Over and above that, recognising that there are specific sectors, specific costs associated with those sectors, we put in place, despite the criticism from the Conservatives, up to 30 bespoke funds, which dealt with the particular issues faced either by the hospitality industry or by some of the wholesalers in the supply chain or other schemes. Now, those have all opened. They are distributing funding. Some of them have closed, having distributed that funding, but there are still that third category of business that haven't received much, or have only received furlough or self-employed income support scheme. And that's why we've put in place the discretionary funding. Now, the discretionary funding is up to £120 million. It was increased from £30 million to £120 million. In terms of guidance to local authorities, we want them to use that funding for businesses that haven't had help yet. It's up to local authorities what the quantum is. Last time I checked, I'm pretty sure the Conservatives are in power in Aberdeen Council, so I hope that Alexander Burnett has also made representations to them about the level of quantum and the criteria associated with that to provide support to his constituents.
Yeah, thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I did go to Aberdeenshire Council in the first place regarding the discretionary funding for outside caterers. They said it was not within their discretion. This was a matter for the government. I wrote to yourself, and you said this is a matter for Aberdeenshire Council. So for circumstances like that, who should I approach on behalf of these constituents, and where will they get support?
Well, you are right to approach both of us, and at the moment, I'm open to considering whether we need to top up the discretionary fund, but the discretionary fund is the vehicle for helping all the businesses they need. I personally would endorse wholeheartedly the approach that Highland Council has taken. I don't always or necessarily ever praise Highland Council, but in this occasion I think they've done a really, really good job, where the criteria is essentially, if you haven't had funding from elsewhere and you've seen a 50% reduction in trade, it doesn't matter what sector you're in, we can provide support, with a few exceptions, those that are getting bespoke schemes already. So that, to my mind, seems like a very logical way of doing it. They have even said that they're looking at an additional top-up to those that receive the initial £2,000 grant. So some councils are doing a great job. and I'm happy to send more details about what Highland Council have done to the member if that would be helpful in his discussions with Aberdeenshire Council.
Thank you. Just a final point. This is less about the top up. This is about really the how the criteria are being applied. I wouldn't expect the Cabinet Secretary to be able to answer on a specific case, but perhaps if I can write to her after this, she could respond so she can look in detail at the problem that we're facing, where there's a differing view on criteria of qualification between Aberdeenshire Council and herself.
I'm happy to look into that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary. As members will have heard at the beginning of the discussion, there have been some manuscript amendments lodged to reflect corrections to administrative error in some of the figures in the amendments lodged for Stage 2. And understanding orders, it's for me to determine whether to allow these amendments to be moved, and I confirm that I will allow them. A revised Marshall list has been circulated to the committee. I think it was circulated at 10:36 by Mary Gavin. But before we move into the formal Stage 2 process, I'm going to suspend for a little while before we go there. But before we go there, can I ask Dougie McLaren to provide us with some information on these corrections? Dougie McLaren, who's the Deputy Director of Public Spending. Dougie.
Thank you, Convener. So we had circulated to the committee just before the weekend some figures on a spreadsheet which members may or may not have in front of them, but what they did was they itemised all the individual components of proposed spending that then made up the amendments in the list that were lodged on Friday. So there were 13 amendments. 11 of these were for changes to portfolio totals, 10 portfolio totals, and then one separate one for National Record of Scotland. And then there were two sort of totalling amendments, one for the budget use of resources and one for cash authorisation. Now, since lodging on Friday and very laterally, we've discovered an error in our figures, which flowed through to 3 of the amendments. So I'll just quickly explain what that error was. It relates to the communities and local government portfolio, where we had, within our figures, left in a figure for non-domestic rates, 541 million, which relates to the extension of the reliefs for the full year in 21-22 for retail, hospitality and leisure, aviation and independent schools. But of course, in the bill, that should not have changed the overall spending allocation, because what actually happens, as members will know from previous times that there have been Budget Act revisions for NDR, what happens is that the revenues are reduced, and therefore the distributable amount to local government is reduced, and that will be reflected in the forthcoming local government finance order. But then offsettingly, the general revenue grant is increased. So the 541 million increase to the general revenue grant is offset by the 541 reduction in receipts, which flows through to the distributable amount. So there should of course be no net change to the budget bill. So what we have done is we have tabled requested manuscript amendments, which have come through this morning. So there's a replacement amendment for the communities and local government portfolio with the right figure. So Amendment 14 replaces Amendment 2. Then there's a replacement amendment for the total budget use of resources in Schedule 1. So Amendment 15 would replace Amendment 12. And then lastly, there's a replacement Amendment 16 for the total cash authorisation, which replaces Amendment 13 that was lodged on Friday. So in summary, our plan or proposal is to not move amendments 2, 12 and 13 and instead to lodge amendments number 14, 15 and 16.
Okay, has anyone got any questions they want to ask of Dewey before I move to suspend? And you'll put R in the chat bar as normal. Okay, I'm not seeing any R's in the chat bar. I'm going to now suspend for around 15 minutes just to make sure everyone's aware of what's going on before we move to the formal proceedings at stage 2. I'll indicate in the chat bar at approximately 11:45 that we are ready to restart, because obviously I need a new script for this purpose. So we'll suspend until 11:45 and I'll indicate in the chat bar when we're ready to start. Thank you, colleagues. We now turn to agenda item 2, formal proceedings of the stage 2 of the Budget Scotland Bill. I remind members that they can request to speak by tapping R in the Blue Jeans chat function once I call the group. But please only speak when I call your name. And members will be aware we've had manuscript amendments lodged for consideration of stage 2. Members should now have the revised marshalled list. So let me commence. And the first question is that section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And I will call Amendment 1 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, groups with Amendment 2 to 16. And I would draw in doing so members' attention to the notes on groupings in regard to direct alternatives. Direct alternatives are 2 or more amendments seeking to replace the same text in a bill with alternative approaches. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to remove Amendment 1 and speak to all amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. I will talk to all amendments. All 13 amendments reflect the additional funding notified to us by the UK Government since the bill's introduction. Amendment 1 increases the health and sport authorisation by £211 million of resource. That's £120 million for mental health, £60 million for NHS recovery, £31 million for further COVID pressures. Amendment 2 isn't moved, and I thank the convener for his understanding in that regard. Amendment 3 increases the education and skills authorisation by £60 million of resource for education recovery. Amendment 4 increases the justice authorisation by £1 million for legal aid traineeships. Amendment 5 increases the transport infrastructure and connectivity authorisation by £25 million of resource for additional transport network costs. Amendment 6 increases the environment, climate change and land reform authorisation by £2.05 million of resource for income shortfall in the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, and in NGOs. Amendment 7 increases the rural economy and tourism authorisation by £10 million of capital grant for rural tourism infrastructure. Amendment 8 increases the economy, fair work and culture authorisation by £481.5 million. That's £460 million for the strategic framework business support, as well as £21.5 million of FTs for Scottish Enterprise. Amendment 9 increases the social security and older people authorisation by £4.6 million to expand the self-isolation support grant. Amendment 10 increases the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs authorisation by £2.6 million of resource for COVID resilience and recovery support for the armed forces community sector. Amendment 11 is for the National Records of Scotland, £1.1 million of resource for income shortfall. Amendment 12 and 11 aren't moved. Amendment 14 increases the communities and local government authorisation by £307 million of funding. That's £100 million of resource, £187 million of capital grant and £20 million of FTs. And I know that time is marching on, but perhaps if I could just go into the detail of that. That's £100 million of resource for anti-poverty measures, £100 million of capital grant for housing, £20 million of FTs for housing, £45 million of capital grant for fuel poverty and energy efficiency, £30 million of capital grant for town centre fund and £12 million of capital grant for local bridge maintenance fund. Amendment 15 increases the overall total amount of resources in Schedule 1 by £1.1 billion. That's £866 million of resource, £107 million of capital grant and £40 million of FTs. And Amendment 16 increases the total cash authorisation for the Scottish Government by £1.10525 billion. Convener. Convener, apparently I said that Amendment 11 wasn't moved. That was a slip. It's Amendment 12 and 13 that aren't moved. So hopefully that is sufficient information. Thank you.
Okay. No member put an R in the chat bar. Can I assume from that that no one else wants to contribute at this stage? That does seem to be the case. Therefore, The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I call Amendment 2 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I now call Amendment 14 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved formally.
Good. The question therefore is Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I now call Amendments 3 to 11, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and all previously debated. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 3 to 11 en bloc.
Moved en bloc 3 to 11.
Thank you. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 3 to 11? If any member disagrees, please shout N in the chat bar. No one's disagreed. The question is therefore Amendments 3 to 11 are agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Now call Amendment 12 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Not moved.
Sorry, you're right, it shouldn't have been moved. Sorry, I shouldn't have asked you to do that, but we'll go through the formal process anyway. The question is Amendment, well, we don't need to go to the question, is that Amendment 12 be agreed, because it's not been moved. And now call Amendment 15 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Amendment 15 moved formally.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Schedule 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 2, Schedule 2, Section 3 and Schedule 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Oh, wait a minute. I've got Kate Fobbs put an R in there. Sorry, Kate. Apologies.
Sorry, Convener. We had the discussion about Amendment 12 not moved. The same, of course, applies to Amendment 2, which wasn't moved as well. So 212.
Yeah, thank you. That was put into the chat bar by one of the clerks as well. So I'm just going with the script I've got in front of me, so forgive me. Sorry, where I got to? I now call Amendment 13 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Not moved, Amendment 13.
Apologies, I'm just following this as it's stuck in front of me. If it's not moved, we therefore don't need to vote on it. I now call Amendment 16 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved Amendment 16 formally.
The question is that Amendment 16 be agreed to. Are all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Sections 5 to 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. The question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Given that we're all agreed, I'm glad to say that ends stage 2 of consideration of the bill. Thank you, and for any of the glitches that went on in the middle of that as well. I thank your colleagues, and I thank Kate Forbes, the Cabinet Secretary, for being with us this morning, and I now close this meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee. All the best.